Buongiorno a tutti. Hello, everyone. My name is Amelia Linsky. I'm here today with Ellen Lockhart, Assistant Professor of Musicology at the University of Toronto, to discuss her new book, Animation, Plasticity, and Music in Italy, 1770 to 1830, published in 2017 by the University of California Press. Thank you very much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Professor Lockhart takes an interdisciplinary approach to her research on the aesthetics of musical practice in the 18th and 19th centuries, combining music history and the history of science to flesh out our knowledge of Italian musical practice. She has made critical editions of operas by Donizetti and Puccini and has recently co-edited a volume on music and science in London during the period 1798 to 1851. She's an enthusiastic performer of chamber music on the viola and the piano. First, let's set the scene and lay out the currents of thought in musical theory that flow throughout your work. Your book tracks how the motif of the animated statue became a fundamental figure in theater, opera, and ballet in Italy before the unification of 1861. At this time, Italy was just a geographical area, and the idea of a unified Italy was often connected to French or Austrian hegemony. So what are some of the major threads of philosophical or nationalist thought that the statue represents or ties into?
Well, that's an excellent question, Amelia, and I would say there are two main currents of thought that are important to understand when you read the book that I wrote or look at the history surrounding the book. And one of them does have to do with nationalism, and the other one has to do with philosophy. Now, nationalism as we know it is really a product of the 19th century, and it doesn't really exist in the at the historical moment when my book begins, and by the time it ends around 1830, it's really quite fully fledged, and I trace the emergence of some of its themes. But the understanding that nationalism gives us, people who work on the history of music, is that the stylistic musical map of Europe should really look a lot like the political map of Europe. So Germany will have German styles and an opera in which people sing German, and France will have French styles and an opera in which people sing French. So that was emphatically not the case in the 18th century, and in fact, really across the entire map of Europe, with the exception of France, from London really to Moscow, music in Europe was Italian music, and opera was Italian opera. But there was not a political entity that you could map those styles onto. And in fact, if you look at the Italian peninsula, you'll see, of course, the mosaic of little principalities and territories, many of which are occupied or under the dominion of other countries. And one of the themes within rhetoric about Italians' potential political self-determination is the statue, which comes up quite a lot, and often in quite negative ways. So people will say, I went to Rome and the population there is a quarter statues, and the other three quarters are starving, the cover image of my book, which we can see right here, is the so-called Belvedere torso. And the middle chapter of my book talks about how this is described as itself being a symbol of Italy. Like, you can see what it once was, but its head has fallen off. So its ability to self-determine the movements has fallen off. The limbs have fallen off. So it's an object of beauty, but an old object of beauty, and one without the capability of self-determination. The other important current is philosophical. And the 18th century, of course, within philosophy is the great age of empiricism, meaning that a new degree of trust is put in what people perceive through the senses. And a lot of major currents within 18th century philosophy follow on John Locke's notion of the tabula rasa, that humans are a blank slate on which experience writes things. And the statue in itself becomes a kind of thought experiment to imagine what exactly the human is and how the human is made through the senses. And the most important document within that tradition is something that I talk a lot about in my book, is a treatise on the sensations by Condillac, who was a contemporary and friend of Rousseau. And Condillac made the argument that all of the more sophisticated modes of human thought could be derived just from sensory stimulation. So his thought experiment invites the reader to imagine a statue, or more specifically to imagine herself or himself as a statue. And then the nose is activated, nothing else but just the nose. And then a rose is put below the nose so the statue can perceive the rose. And that act of perception generates attention. And then a whole series of other flowers is passed beneath the nose, and that generates memory and the ability to compare objects, the ability to prefer one object over another, and of course pleasure. So that, in that sense, the statue as a kind of tabula rasa of the human body, all told, is a very crucial symbol for a lot of Enlightenment thought. And one of the consequences of that, of this kind of radical empiricism, is that it puts a lot of emphasis on what people perceive over the course of their lifetimes, and their ability to perceive beauty, and what the arts, what beautiful objects that they do see within the arts or within nature are teaching them. And this in itself could be, and often was, a very positive discourse for Italians, because they were perceived as being the most, the people with the richest traditions and often the greatest potential in the creation of fine arts, music especially, also sculpture and painting. Obviously, the Renaissance tradition looms large there.
So we've seen how the statue is evoked in philosophical thought and in nationalist thought, or pre-nationalist thought, in relation to Italy's identity and the identity of Italians. But for most of the book, you focus on how the statue is then evoked in performance. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little more about a performance that will draw us into this recurring motif of the statue and its importance in the minds of composers and the audience, also choreographers, mm-hmm. A single performance or even many, and how we can see the statue everywhere?
Well, the first thing that you notice if you look at Ovid's version of the story of Pygmalion, the Metamorphoses is the first text that tells the story of Pygmalion in detail, is that it's very erotic and very explicit. So Ovid tells the story of a sculptor who loathes women and eschews their presence entirely. But he makes a very beautiful woman and falls in love with that. And in the Ovid, he takes it to bed, makes love to it, puts necklaces on it, puts a bra on it, and then eventually Venus takes pity on him because she sees how undignified he's become and brings this woman to life. And actually, I often wonder about this. Interestingly, within some iconographic traditions, particularly medieval iconographic traditions of Pygmalion, the statue is about this big. So you have to wonder, does it change size when it comes to life, or is she always going to be this big? But there's the paradigmatic Enlightenment version of this story. Follows a very specific format, and it doesn't stage the sculpting, and the misogyny doesn't really feature. It's a monologue that Pygmalion utters before the statue as statue, in which he talks about how much he loves her and how embarrassing it is, and how does his desire go so astray, and is he actually in love with himself because he made the object himself, and so on. And then he kind of falls into a despair. In some versions he prays, in some versions he just kind of slumps over. And then there is music heard. And in the earliest version of this, which is by Rousseau, of this particular version, he writes flute calm. But it could be really any music. And the music that's heard there in different versions is enormously different. There isn't sort of one sound that brings the statue to life. But after the music is heard, the statue steps down off of its pedestal and becomes a living woman. And then she touches herself and she says, moi. And Rousseau takes this right out of Condiac's treatise, by the way. She touches her legs or somewhere else on her body and says that this is still moi, and then she touches Pygmalion and says this is not moi, and then they embrace one another, and that's the end. It's relatively chaste, but it has these really specific features, and the most sort of non-negotiable ones are the music that plays to bring her to life, which is one of the reasons why I'm interested in it and why it tells us so much about how music is perceived at this time and what it does. And then the other one is the moi, the fact that the first thing that she utters when she comes to life is a first person pronoun. And bringing us into it, I mean, this version of the story was staged dozens of times, and there were even hundreds of times. There were dozens of different musical scores composed for it. It exists in so many versions, really hardly any of which are performed now. Actually, 2 weeks ago, the New York City Opera did a double Pygmalion, one of them by Rameau from the middle of the 18th century, and one by Donizetti from about 1816. And it's, other than that kind of, once in a blue moon thing, is quite difficult to see what this kind of thing would have looked like. But there are a couple of places we can look to get a kind of a glimpse into this 18th, early 19th century fascination with the moving statue. And one of them is extremely early cinema. So Georges Méliès, who's one of the first filmmakers, has several statues that come to life. And he uses splicing to do it. So it'll actually be a statue on the film, and then he'll cut it, and it'll be a woman. And it's quite jerky because the woman doesn't quite look the way the statue did, and so on. But it's definitely he's definitely picking up on an older performance tradition there. And I often think that one of the other places that we can get a sense of the kind of frisson that audiences got from this are on tourist routes, when you see the living statues that just sort of stand there and they hold their pose. That's definitely a kind of a descendant of a common ancestor with these, which is commedia dell'arte style performance. And in the way it exists in the modern world, it's very much unmoored from kind of plot or device. There'll just be like a Spider-Man sitting there, or Marilyn Monroe, or Elvis, all silver. And the way that there's a kind of this frisson when you encounter one of these people, and is it moving? Is it real? Is it a person? I think that can just if you see one of these people, give yourself a moment and look at it and feel the way it makes you feel, and I think that gives us something of a window into how fascinating these things were for people in the period that I study.
So to wrap up this conversation, maybe, do you think that frisson is similar or the same to the historical feeling that you talk about in the book, or is it different?
I mean, it's obviously different in a lot of ways. I couldn't make a strong claim that it was the same feeling by any stretch, but I think that the kinds of questions that are posed to the viewer by these performers are the same questions that brought people back again and again to that kind of performance on stage within sort of more highly respected forms of musical theater.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful discussion, Professor Lockhart.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in.